Today's episode is brought to you by RDG Planning and Design. We're architects, landscape architects, engineers, artists, and planners with a passion for design and a drive to make a difference. We believe in applying new ways of thinking and innovative approaches to the preparation of plans that address community and regional issues. With offices in Omaha, Nebraska, St. Louis, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, and Des Moines, Iowa, we are a network of design and planning professionals dedicated to applying our talents in extraordinary ways. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host and manager, Paul Barnes, who leads our long-range division in the department. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have helped shape the field. Let's dive in. Our guest today is Eric Damian Kelly, author of Community Planning, An Introduction to the Comprehensive Plan. Eric is an emeritus professor of urban planning at Ball State University and a longtime planning consultant, including nearly 30 years in association with James Duncan and Associates. He is a past president of the American Planning Association and has more than 40 years of experience consulting with local governments in 35 states. Thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Can you start off by telling us a little bit more about yourself and why you decided to write this book?
Those are two really different questions. I decided to write the book. I'd been consulting for years. I had a lot of students going through a planning program. I taught introduction to planning at times. And I thought there was way too much planning philosophy taught, planning theory. That's important. I think it's very important. I don't think it should be the foundation for practicing planners. Practicing planners need to know how communities work and how plans can help them. And that was really my goal in writing the book, and to serve two markets: the students who I hoped would grow up to be planners, or at least many of them would, and also citizen planners. And it was written with both those groups in mind. What am I doing now? I'm still doing a little bit of consulting. I'm hiding in Florida right now, but everybody can find me here. And when I'm in Indiana, I teach yoga.
Very good. Thank you, Eric. I think we'll go ahead and jump into the first question. With this book, why did you feel it was important to start a book on the comprehensive plan by discussing sprawl and sustainability? And how do these topics differ in different regions and cities as they relate to comprehensive planning?
Okay, those are two complicated questions. But I thought sprawl is something that most people in the country who are dealing with growth are experiencing in some way, shape, or form. It's something tangible they can see in their day-to-day lives. I think it's something they can relate to, and I thought it was important to address that from the beginning and to talk about how planning can help to address that issue. Well, my publisher was Island Press, and they were not thrilled with the first draft. They didn't think there was enough sustainability in it. And I looked back at it and I agreed with them. And I went back and added a good bit of that. I've always worked at sustainability, even before it was popular, when we just used to call it environmentalism and things like that. But that sort of underlies everything. My first job as a planning consultant was with a firm that was dominated by landscape architects. And you can't work with landscape architects on planning issues and not think about sustainability and think about planning with nature, as Ian Card put it, design with nature. So that's influenced me my whole life, and I thought it was important to weave that in.
Excellent. So Chapter 3 discusses the differences between advocacy planning and providing education to the community. There seems to be a fine line distinction between these two topics. For example, longstanding policies of good planning in a community may be challenged during a comprehensive plan update. In that case, shouldn't the planner continue to advocate for such policies?
Yes and no. And it depends on what your role is. I gave a lecture at the University of Colorado years ago, planning versus democracy. And if you really come down on the side of democracy, the advocacy is not as critical. The education is. If you're a strong believer in planning, you're going to advocate for the planning principles all the way through. And I think everybody has to make that choice on their own. I don't think it has to be a fine line. I run into this issue a lot. A lot of my consulting these days is on First Amendment issues, dealing with signs and sex businesses. And those are things on which I do have opinions that often don't fit communities where I'm working. So in dealing with those, I try to provide education, say, here are your choices. Here are some of the things that may happen if you make these choices. Here are some of the things that may happen if you don't do anything. And without advocating. And then when I advocate, I'm pretty upfront about it. I'll say, this is what I think you ought to do, but hey, you all have to make the decisions. So I don't think it's a real fine line, but there are those who totally believe in advocacy planning, and I'm not opposed to that. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not sure they should run the planning process.
Very good. During development of a comprehensive plan, it is important to involve the community throughout the process. So those that care will attend meetings or become engaged on their own, but what about everyone else? How do we reach underrepresented groups and get them excited and involved in the process?
Well, you have to find them and know where they are. I participate in holding a lot of public meetings in church basements, in elementary schools, places where we'll find people who might not show up otherwise. I think that's terribly important. I have some former students of mine who work in Amish communities. The Amish philosophically won't come to meetings, but you can go out and talk to them one-on-one and get some sense of who they are and what they want and what they believe in. You have to really work at it. But the other thing is there are people who may not have opinions that are particularly useful to the process, and you have to sort of sort out. An underrepresented community that is poor ought to have influence on the process, and it matters a whole lot. If you've got a group with some radical position that's hard to reconcile, to me, the anti-vaxxers sort of fall in that right now. I don't know that you have to reconcile that with the comprehensive plan. And I don't know that you need to set up meetings for anti-vaxxers to participate in defining the future of the community. But each community has to decide that. If there's a big group of them, you certainly don't want to ignore them.
Follow-up question to that, knowing the climate that we're in right now where it's hard to go out in person and to go meet people, do you think we've seen more of a challenge in reaching these underrepresented groups, or have we still been able to achieve that?
Well, I don't know. I haven't been doing as much professional work recently. I think the challenge is much greater because the underrepresented groups are often economically disadvantaged. They don't have full computer access. They may not even have computers. And so to think that we're going to get them to a lot of online meetings is crazy. That's not going to happen. And to the extent we can't do that, then we have to figure out what alternatives are. On the other hand, I think that you'll find that a lot of those people are still going to church, going to the PTA and things like that. I think there are ways to reach them, and I think it's very important to do that and not just go totally online and think, oh, everybody will show up for our webinars and for our Zoom meetings and so on. Those are useful, but I think it's very important to use as many other techniques as you can use, and those have to be adapted to the community. When we do a big project, and I'm not doing as many of those anymore, but we'd go into the community, we'd take 2 or 3 key people into the community for maybe 3 days just to meet with a lot of leaders of the community, including leaders of disadvantaged groups and so on, and ask them what the issues are and how do we reach people and how should we go about this.
Great. I think those are excellent ways to do other outreach and for our planning audience to consider. Eric, Chapter 5 discusses possible futures for a community when developing the comprehensive plan and how to balance the vision with reality. So what about those big ideas that are generated during development of a comprehensive plan? How do planners translate those big ideas into realistic policies or action steps?
It can be tough. And let me tell you a story in which I didn't get involved and I should have. This was in my hometown of Pueblo, Colorado. And I wasn't living there at the time. I actually, overlapping this, came back as part of a team to do a comprehensive plan. But Pueblo and San Antonio flooded the same year, 1921, and they had terrible floods. And in both communities, the engineers wanted to channel the river and avoid this problem for the future. In San Antonio, a women's garden club stood up and said, "You can't do this." And they found an architect who would work with them. And if you've been to San Antonio, the result is what you see now, the Riverwalk. Pueblo went the other way and channelized the river. But they didn't totally channelize it. There was a piece of it that was flowing underground to provide cooling to a power plant that was located near the downtown area. So it was still down there. So a group of people, led in part by a friend of mine who was a community college president, said, let's dig up the river. There was a major road that ran over it that was one of the major arterials of the community. There were all sorts of facilities there. They were talking huge expanse. This was certifiably nuts. And if you want to see how nuts it is, Google the Historic Arkansas River Project and see it. It's phenomenal. It has done wonderful things for the community. And it's a huge project. It's a huge success. That's nuts. I don't know what I would have done with that if we had been working on the comprehensive plan at the time. But usually you can kind of winnow them out. If somebody wants to build a big ski resort in Lincoln, this probably isn't going to work. The weather and some other things tell you, no, this is not a possibility. So you can weed those out. But then other thing, it's worth keeping the ideas in, just float them out there, do one of those exercises where you put a bunch of things up on easels and give everybody dots and let them put dots on things they really like and see if it gets any traction, see if it'll go anywhere. You don't want to lose the big ideas. On the other hand, you don't want to come back with a comprehensive plan that is totally focused on building a ski resort in the middle of Nebraska, because it's going to fail. You need some successes. You need some things that are going to work. You need the people in the engineering department and cynics in the business community and all to look and say, well, this is far out there, but it could work. And you have to be able to build that in. So it takes some judgment, and it's not anything one person can do. You kind of need a brain trust behind the scenes, and not all of it is totally transparent. You've got to do some brainstorming and say, okay, what do we do with this, folks?
Excellent point. The term citizen participation is used throughout your book. Considering today's environment, have you seen the need to use instead terms like public participation to be as inclusive as possible?
Well, I think citizen is pretty inclusive, but if you're in a particular community where that doesn't seem inclusive, then perhaps you should, if I were working in a farming community in Southern California with a lot of migrants, I would probably talk public participation to get in, because you've got a lot of non-citizens. But to me, citizen is a fairly inclusive term. But it was never the intent to exclude people who can't vote. It's to include as many people as you reasonably can who reasonably want to be involved.
That's pretty inherent in the planning process that we've been taught through school and practice.
Yeah.
In Chapter 8, Eric, you mentioned some comprehensive plans are ignored in day-to-day planning for public facilities. Why is that, and what can be done to change this issue?
Well, some of those plans are totally unrealistic regarding public facilities. They propose new development where it's not practicable to get sewer and water service. They propose new development that would require huge new roads that, at least before the current infrastructure bill passed Congress, nobody could afford. The way you get around that is you've got to include the engineers in particular from the beginning. You've got to chat with them. You've got to understand their perspectives on the issues. As you get some of these far out ideas, you need to run them by the engineers, and they may not all be engineers. But that's where the major obstacles are, and the people who control public facilities planning. You got to get them involved. I was advising a lot of students when I was at Iowa State, and they'd have to come into my office and go over their previous semester before I'd give them the code they needed to register for classes. And I found this pretty useful. And I had a young woman in my class, and she was getting maybe some B pluses, mostly A's, and she had a D in accounting. And I said, why are you taking accounting? That's not required for your planning degree. She said, well, my dad told me I had to. And I said, so you're going to prove to your dad what a dumb idea it was by getting a really bad grade? That's exactly what she was doing. But the engineers who get a plan on which they've had no input, no opportunity to provide a realistic perspective, can be exactly the same way. They can help prove what a bad idea was. I'm not saying they necessarily do it maliciously. It's just kind of human nature. Hey, these folks didn't want to listen to us. Why should we listen to them? No, you've got to keep them involved. And at every stage, when you start putting together those plan maps, you want to go down and run them by them. So they say, wait a minute, we can do most of this, but we're never going to get water up there.
Yeah, that seems to be along the theme of inclusiveness, bringing in the experts. Well, Chapter 8 concludes that municipal agencies engage planners far too little. In this case, is it the responsibility of the planner to educate and engage these agencies? How can a relationship be built across a wide variety of government departments and agencies?
Donuts, lunch, coffee, all sorts of, get a beer after work. It depends on the local culture. But you've got to build relationships, and they're probably not going to reach out to you. Planning is a people-oriented field. Most engineering schools are not people-oriented. So they're not naturally going to say, oh, we ought to get to know those planners. You need to say, hey, we need to get to know them. They might be interesting people. They might be smart people. They might know some things we don't know. They very likely do know some things we don't know. So I think it's the responsibility of the planners. Do I think those other agencies should reach out to planners? Sure, I do. But the real world we live in tells me that many of them probably are not going to do it. And, there are weird solutions to it. In Florida, every planning board has to have a school board member on it. And they only get to vote on school-related issues. But in my experience, they mostly attend the meetings. And they offer comments when you're looking at a huge new subdivision. They'll say, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to have a school near there in the next 20 years. And, if the developer's not going to pay for it, this just doesn't make sense. So there's some institutional things that can be done. In that case, the state legislature did it.
Yeah, I found in some of the other communities I've worked in, the most successful coordination was having a set development review meeting every week where all the different, building and safety, streets, water, sewer, planners, everyone would meet weekly and go over projects so that everyone was aware and on the same page.
I agree, but I have seen communities where that didn't work because agencies wouldn't send their best people. So if anything controversial came up, the guy from the Parks Department would say, I don't know, I've got to get back to you on this. So then you couldn't really get decisions made. That works better if you get key people. They don't have to be the department heads, but if you get key people who are at least influencers from each of the departments. I agree with you, but they're a hazard.
All good points made. Moving on to the next question here. In Chapter 9, Eric, you discussed the comprehensive plan approval process. How important is transparency when approving a comprehensive plan, and how is transparency demonstrated to the community?
Well, to me, transparency is circulating drafts and concept papers and all sorts of things as early and as much as possible so that people who are interested can stay involved with it. Now, you can overdo this. If you bury people with paper, they'll quit coming to meetings, they will lose interest. That's not going to work. But yeah, you need to be transparent throughout the whole thing. I talked earlier about having a brain trust to talk about a few of the big ideas, but mostly you want to keep it out there. Certainly put it on a website that's accessible and hopefully user-friendly, because they aren't all. And then recognize that there are people who don't have access to that and figure out ways to get materials to them. 20 years ago, we could often talk a newspaper into publishing a supplement on the comprehensive plan. Now there aren't many newspapers, so I'm not sure what the solutions to those are. I've seen people send handouts to schools that kids take home and all sorts of different things. But you've got to think about it. At a minimum, as you're doing all these things and putting them online, you need to have drafts in the public library and some places like that people who don't have computer service at home or don't have fast broadband to bring down big documents can find these documents and review them.
Very good points. I'm going to move on to what I'm going to selfishly call our favorite chapter, because in chapter 13, you give a shout out to Lincoln. Thank you for that. In Lincoln, we effectively manage growth by following our annexation policy, where city utilities are only provided if properties are annexed. So we'd like to have you explain the difference between urban growth and urban service area boundaries. How are these tools used in city development, and how can a comprehensive plan lay the groundwork for these tools?
I think Lincoln has it right. And there aren't enough communities that are doing that. That's the best control you have. Communities have tried adopting urban growth boundaries as regulatory tools and saying, well, we don't control our service areas very well, so we're going to draw lines and say you can only grow within those. Those don't hold up much better than lines on a zoning map. The urban service area controls are by far the most effective, and I'm a huge advocate of using those as much as possible. Wiring annexation, I think all of this development that takes place in rural areas without annexation is crazy, is irresponsible, and over the long run, it's going to be costly. Somebody's going to pay for it. I remember when my mom sat on city council and I was around, they would annex some very poor areas just because the infrastructure was collapsing and the city could afford to fix the infrastructure. That was then expensive for the city. It would have been cheaper if it had been done right in the first place. The other thing I've seen in Delaware County, Indiana, where I'm living right now, they had some rural sewer districts that were set up. That's not the technical name in Indiana, but that built sewer systems for some small communities in rural, and these weren't tiny, they were a few thousand people. And it was pretty clear they weren't working well. I mean, there was stuff leaking out on the surface and all. I don't know who did the original work on these, but they brought in actual engineers to look at the whole thing. They started digging it up. They found sewer connections that had been made with duct tape. This was a nightmare. Some of these people are now paying more than $100 a month for sewer service, which is basically amortizing the cost of putting in the replacement systems for the poorly designed system that was put in the first place. And the replacement systems are pretty low tech. These are not real fancy ones. They're going to take serious maintenance over the years, but they're designed so that they can function. So there are a lot of problems with allowing all this rural development. And I have to tell you, the world is against us on this right now, at least the political world. The legislatures in most states are rural oriented. They're not very urban oriented. Many of them are property rights oriented, so they're not real enthusiastic about restricting development in these ways. I see this annexation laws in states softened all the time, and I think that's a big mistake.
So we've seen in the recent census that more areas are urbanizing and losing population from rural areas. How do you think that's going to impact these decision makers at that level?
I'm not sure, because I'm not sure how carefully they evaluate that data, how well they understand it. Many of them run for office for other reasons. And I don't know, I think it's a fair question. It may help, but I'm not totally sure. And certainly some stories like the ones around Muncie, where I live, ought to have an impact. On the other hand, I chaired a committee that was appointed by the city and the county under state law to propose a government reorganization. We proposed a consolidation of the city and the county. And it was a bipartisan committee. It was very carefully thought out. There was a lot of interest in this. We've had a lot of corruption. The last mayor is currently in federal prison, and some other people are headed there. By the time we got finished with our proposal, and everybody on the committee supported it, both the Republican and Democratic Party turned against us. And we still got 37% of the vote in favor of it. We had no campaign money. We had no organization. We put our effort into coming up with a good plan. And candidly, at that point, the Democratic Party was run by a machine. It was clear they weren't, and I'm a Democrat, but it was clear my party wasn't going to go with us. I really thought the Republicans would be there. One of their concerns, and this goes far afield, but it partly answers your question. One of the things that our proposal would do was cut down the number of elections each year. So we were going to consolidate the school district and the local elections and so on. And I think it was going to eliminate one election every 4 years. The poll workers at that point were paid like something like $15 a day or something. It was probably more. It may have been 25. It wasn't much. But the party leaders were distressed about not being able to hand those jobs out that extra time every 4 years. And that was what knocked the Republican Party out for us. So you wonder how decision makers are going to decide. You don't always know.
Still in Chapter 13, which discusses annexation and mentions that in some areas, special districts and private utilities will allow land to be developed outside of the city. What are the pros and cons of these approaches versus annexation into a city? And follow up to that, would you agree that there's an equity to taxpayers argument for annexation, since properties outside the city would also benefit from many city services such as streets, parks, trails, and libraries?
Yes, and I don't think there are any pros to the current pattern of special districts and all. I think from a larger there are pros for particular landowners who profit from them, for particular developers, but looked at from any level of society, government costs, government management and all, I don't think there are any pros. I think they're all negatives.
How do you address housing choice in the market if people are interested in living on larger lots in a rural setting, say acreage developments?
That's a real challenge. It's interesting. We see a lot of that in Indiana, and it's interesting. I'll go through an area with 5-acre lots. In the first 2 or 3 years, there's grass planted on the whole thing. They maintain it all. By the 3rd and 4th and 5th years, well, maybe they're maintaining 2 or 3 acres up around the house. You go back into some of those areas, 7 or 8 years, they're just maintaining a garden and maybe an acre or less around the house, and the rest goes to weeds. And if lost from agricultural use, it's pretty much a calamity, except very high end for people who are clearly going to take care of the property. But that's sort of discriminatory to say, oh, only rich people can live on large lots. But in a sense, only rich people can afford to live on large lots.
Eric, next question is on Chapter 14, which describes the coordination that should happen between the CIP, or Capital Improvement Program, and the Comprehensive Plan. The text also describes how the guidance of the comprehensive plan is lost in some communities where other government departments are instead guiding the CIP. What are ways to reinforce the use of the comprehensive plan when making capital decisions?
Part of it's informal. I'm a big advocate for having, once you've got a new comprehensive plan, I think there ought to be at least an annual work session talking about the plan and how it's working and how it's not. And that ought to involve the Plan Commission. It ought to involve your elected officials, whether it's city council or whatever, and leaders from other departments, the roads department or whatever, transportation department, sewer and water, public utilities, and have everybody there and talk about what's going on and what changes are happening in the community and what's working. And that may often lead to some minor fine tuning to the plan to adjust it to make it more realistic. But I think you just have to work with it constantly. And I think a lot of it is informal. And when I talk about having these annual meetings, I strongly recommend that they take place at a neutral place, not in the city council chambers with the city council sitting up there behind their big desks and everybody else down here. It needs to be a very equal kind of thing. And these meetings ought to be open to the public, not necessarily to a lot of public discussion, because you got to be able to get some things done. But public observers certainly ought to be welcome, and there ought to be a way to get follow-up comments from them and so on. But I think just getting the group of people together, and it's probably going to be 30 or 40 people together to have pizza and talk about these issues once a year, is very important.
It is in our city charter that the planning department leads the development of our CIP, which I haven't experienced in other cities. It's formalized in city charter. And so we actually are just beginning that process. We just adopted our new comprehensive plan for 2050, and now we're picking up the CIP and implementing it. So it's fascinating in our community to do this. And I just wanted to, throw that out there. I didn't know if you had heard about that, but, planners leading the CIP it makes so much sense.
It does. I agree.
All right. In Chapter 10, you give an example of how the best comprehensive plans will not force development to happen. How does this apply to communities that are not as attractive to developers?
Then they need to think about what their priorities are and whether the comprehensive plan is really focusing on the right things. There's an economist who's a friend of mine who writes a weekly column for the Muncie paper, but it circulates several other newspapers. And he's conservative at heart, he's ex-military and so on. And he is very critical of economic development efforts these days. He says the key to economic development is schools, parks, quality of life, all of those things. If you get those right, people will want to be there. If people want to be there, businesses will come, and it all works. Offering incentives to bring businesses in or to build a particular type of housing is really missing the point. And this is a conservative economist, but what he's really talking about is good planning.
So as a follow-up to that, what's the role of a planner in a community that's facing that situation?
You probably need to pick out a couple of models that are realistically in the same climate zone as you are, same rough size, with similar history. If it's an old manufacturing community, you want to look at other communities that are manufacturing community and find some that have succeeded and figure out what's made them succeed. Now, Chattanooga, Tennessee was an old industrial community. It's been through awful times. They made a huge early investment in community broadband, and they had some of the best broadband service. And they may still, but they were very early in providing excellent broadband every place in the city. Tacoma, Washington did the same thing. And they said, okay, this is going to make a difference. And if you go look at those communities today, there's a lot going on. It's exciting. Is it perfect? I don't know. How closely does it follow their comprehensive plan? I don't know, but they found keys that would make a difference. And I think you kind of have to do that and look for some of those ideas that, they're not all going to be internally generated from community meetings and so on, unless you have a very well-traveled populace who can come in and say, oh, I was in Idaho last week and saw some great ideas. Or I think the planners have to do some research on things like that. And they can pick up a lot of that from planning conferences.
That's a really good point. And we actually, on one of our projects, when I was working for a consulting firm, we had asked when we were doing our listening sessions, the people involved, when you go on vacations and you go elsewhere, what places do you love and what ideas from there would you want to bring back to your communities?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And maybe that's probably a good idea. Have at least planners in a department fill out questionnaires when they get back from vacation. What did I learn that we could use here? Maybe you get the whole planning commission to do it. It's not a bad idea, and then somebody has to go through those and try to synthesize, look for common themes and all. But yeah, I think that's a terrific idea.
Eric, Chapter 4 mentions that not everyone has access to computers and that this needs to be considered during our public engagement. And we've somewhat discussed this earlier in our interview. How would you describe this situation today, especially while we're still experiencing a pandemic?
I don't know. I mean, that's really tough. We're working on a couple of projects where we've had to try to address that. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I think at least the places I've been, people are somewhat willing to get out now. And I think the communities where I've been recently, if you announce we're going to have a public meeting and there will be social distancing and masks will be required or maybe in some communities you have to say masks aren't required, be forewarned. But I think you can do some things to get people out to be engaged with them. Beyond that, you can do the old-fashioned stuff. Go back to mailed surveys and things like that. They're expensive, but it's not impossible.
We'd like you to discuss the differences between representative and meaningful public participation. Is there room for both of these types of participation during development of a comprehensive plan?
Sure, of course there is. But representative can be a matter of having representatives of all sorts of different groups, many of whom have little to say or they all say the same thing. You want to get meaningful participation that has some meat. People who are passionate about things and really have dug into things and are committed to them and will follow through. When you're implementing the plan, they'll show up and say, yes, we wanted this. We worked on a planning project that was really a mostly student project years ago. We worked with a disadvantaged neighborhood in Muncie, and there was a Walmart store proposed to go into the neighborhood. Well, it was pretty clear to me from the demographics that they were going to like this. There are neighborhoods that wouldn't. So I had a public meeting. I said, do you want Walmart here? And they said, yes. I said, do you want it to look like the one on the north side? They said, no. That was very important to them. And the interesting thing was we came up with design standards that were fairly tough. And Walmart was partway through the process. But the mayor backed us on this. The planning director was with us. And Walmart agreed to everything we proposed, even though it technically wasn't part of the ordinance, except they didn't want to provide bike parking. Their legal people thought that was going to give them some sort of vicarious liability. But, we had much increased landscaping. We had reduced height on the parking lot lights, so we weren't blinding the whole neighborhood. We had different signage. It was a whole new world. They agreed to it all. And 3 or 4 years later, somebody came in with one of the out parcels and wanted a variance to put in a taller sign. Well, I went to the meetings. I wasn't happy about it. Well, I wasn't alone. A lot of the people who participated in this planning process were there to testify against it, and the people did not get their sign variance, which was not typical of this city as a whole. Variances were commonly given, but these people were involved. They were engaged, and they were going to stick up for it. That's meaningful participation. And I think it's very important to have people who care, who are engaged, and they understand what it means.
I think this is the last question for our podcast. So, Eric, what is the most important thing for listeners to take away from this book?
The comprehensive plan isn't a thing, it's a process. And of course, my friends who teach planning theory would say, that we've been saying that all along. But I think it's important to have the thing, to have the maps, to have the document, the policies, and so on. But then to recognize that it's not finished. It's a process. It takes management. It takes involvement. It takes keeping the community involved. And it takes, again, keeping the engineers and people who run operating departments. The police and fire departments need to be involved. And sitting down with the elected officials all at least once a year to talk about these issues, I think is very important. And just to recognize it's a dynamic process, and it should be a dynamic document.
I have to say that I've really enjoyed this interview, Eric. And if you're ever around Lincoln or in the area, I'd love to grab a beer with you and pick your brain more.
Sure. I'd be glad to chat with you.
I just want to say we really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today and coming on the podcast.
Okay, good. Well, I appreciate your inviting me. This has been fun for me.